Okay. And now I need to go back. Okay. So you can go with the videos then, because we have two people in the room. Okay. And now
Think of a great street in your city. Older buildings with shops and restaurants on the ground level, and apartments and offices above. Lots of people walking around, meeting with friends, and bumping into strangers. A great street is a destination in its own right. Yet in most cities, streets like these have become outdated. You'll need a car to get to where you're going. Once you pick up on it, you can realize how a city's design can really change your life, and how it influences everything from a city's vitality to housing costs, even crime. But how did we get to a place where so many American city streets are bad? To figure out how American cities got this way, you need to go back to the 1920s and 30s, when the modernist planning establishment began tightening zoning regimes that neatly separated commercial, industrial, and residential building. The stated purpose of zoning laws was to prevent nuisances and pollution where people lived, but also to guide developers to build and buyers to live in the single-family home, widely viewed by city planners as incubators of the ideal American family. To do this, city governments carved out wide swaths of city land and confined them to single-family homes, typically restricting residency to one family. And this presented some major problems.
So when you zone something for single-family homes as opposed to multifamily homes, it has the effect of making housing units more expensive.
That's economist Sandy Ikeda. He says that one of the main effects of single-family zoning was to lower the availability of low-income housing.
I mean, very simply, it's more complicated than this, but if you have a lot which can accommodate one big house, let's say for 4,000 square feet, if you could divide that up into 4 smaller units of 1,000 square feet each, the individual units could be sold or rented out at a lower price.
Take a look at this zoning map of San Francisco, with the single-family zoning colored in red. The city is dominated by single-family zoned housing, and that's a major reason why San Francisco's housing costs are the highest in the United States. Cities across the country have begun to build out by heavily regulating the ability to build up, creating scarcity at attractive city centers and bidding up the price closer to city downtowns.
And so the supply has not kept up with this increasing demand. You want people to live in dwellings that have a minimum size, but the consequence of that is people who can't afford that minimum size won't be able to live in those dwellings. And so what are they going to do? Is there a logical stopping point to minimum housing sizes? You know, why don't you make the minimum house size 2,000 square feet? Then we'd all live in palaces, or 4,000 square feet. Let's make everybody in New York City live in a single family home. That'll solve the problem.
Single-family zoning laws of the 20s and 30s went a long way to realize the vision of cities held by modernist planners. But they weren't enough, and by the 1950s and 60s, cities weren't just blocking traditional urban neighborhoods from being built. Armed with new federal backing, cities gained license to rezone and condemn neighborhoods as blight, often wiping out entire neighborhoods for minor building design infractions, like not having wide enough lawns separating each dwelling. This had the added and often deliberate effect of forcing out poorer minority residents from the city, who tended to live in denser multifamily homes that were disliked by most modernist planners.
The explicit reason was to promote safety. Later on, many of these zoning codes were used to segregate populations, either explicitly by race or by cultural backgrounds.
In place of these neighborhoods, the modernists favored further single-family home building, but they also favored long, wide streets and narrow sidewalks, with the goal of reshaping American cities around the automobile. They would erect massive civic centers and plazas, sometimes with the primary goal of achieving architectural aesthetic, often forgetting the people they were architecting for. And this is when the modernist planners drew a challenger.
A real rebel that everyone points to, and rightly so, is Jane Jacobs.
Uncredentialed and mostly self-trained, Jane Jacobs was a renegade to the status quo in city planning,
who in 1961 published her great book called The Death and Life of Great American Cities, the opening sentence of which is, "This is an attack on urban planning."
According to Jacobs, the modernist planners failed to see the city at street level and saw cities only from their maps and dioramas.
She started going to some of these places inspired by modernist urban planning and realized they're not being used by the people the way that the designers had intended them. In fact, many of them were not being used at all. The response she got was something like, well, people are too dumb to know how to use this. Or she thought, this is crazy. They should be figuring out how people actually use space and then designing those spaces in a way that will accommodate those uses.
Jacobs hated the modernist wide streets and narrow sidewalks, and she condemned their zoning codes that separated residents from the bustle of restaurants and businesses. She warned that these features would isolate people from one another and made cities unwalkable, making streets less safe and weakening the social capital that springs from unplanned interactions of pedestrians. She wrote, "This isn't the rebuilding of cities. This is the sacking of cities." Jacobs focused on how many of the modernist plans had become more important than the people they were drawn for. In a famous essay, she said that there is no logic that can be superimposed on the city. People make it, and it is to them, not buildings, that we must fit our plans. This people-centric perspective to urban design led Jacobs to emphasize the importance of allowing mixed-use zoning, where businesses and residential buildings intermingle and allow residents to walk to businesses. Jacobs noticed that the more people walking on a street, the more interesting a street becomes, attracting what she called eyes on the street, making residents feel safe from potential crime. And instead of long, endless streets, Jacobs emphasized the importance of short blocks, which encouraged pedestrians to make frequent turns and take alternating routes, giving businesses off the beaten path a fighting chance by not favoring any one path to begin with. And with businesses scattered throughout neighborhoods, the city suddenly opens up to pedestrians.
If you understand how a city works or an economy works, it's a result of a lot of people following their own plans. It generates outcomes that nobody can predict.
This unpredictability of people should make us wary of imposing intricate plans on them. So what can city designers do to avoid making the mistakes of the past?
I would say, be aware of the consequences. Try to take into account the costs of what you're doing. The true city, where experimentation goes on, where you have face-to-face contact, where you have social capital, cannot be completely planned. So you have to be modest. You can't make people use something in exactly the way that you want it to.
The idea of neatly designing our cities is tempting, but learning to appreciate the emergent and complex order of the people who live in them might help us better shape them for the future.
U.S. cities grow and develop thanks to a little-known and sometimes arcane set of rules and regulations known as the zoning code. Zoning influences everything from building heights to signage. Understanding the zoning code is key to understanding U.S. cities and how to influence them for the better. In this video, I'm going to go over the basics of zoning, I'm going to describe the pros and cons of zoning, and finally, I'm going to tell you how you can influence the zoning code in your community to make them more walkable, bikeable, and equitable.
So let's start with zoning basics. The zoning code consists of two basic parts, the map and the regulations. Let's start with the map. If you've ever played a SimCity game, you have an idea of how a zoning map works. Every parcel in a city is placed in a zoning district that specifies the types of uses allowed. Now, every city can create their own zoning districts, but they all generally have the same basic types of districts. They are residential, from single-family homes to high-rise apartments in yellow, commercial, including retail, restaurants, and hotels, colored red, industrial, in gray, though some maps will show them in purple, institutional, which means schools and public buildings, typically in blue, and open space in green appropriately. Here's an example of a zoning map. You can see that most of the city is residential in yellow, there's a large industrial section in the northeast, and a few areas of commercial in red. Now zoning maps can get a lot more complicated than just 5 colors. Now in this example map here, you can see all of the colors just mentioned, with the addition of an orangish color for multifamily residential. It's common for zoning districts to separate not only uses, but intensity of uses. You'll often see C1, C2, and C3 zones, where the increasing number means it allows increasing levels of commercial density. In addition, you may also see overlay zones. These zones, as the name implies, lays over the top of other zones and adds additional restrictions and regulations within them. Okay, so that's the map. It assigns every parcel to a district that has its own set of rules regarding use and intensity. Next up are the regulations themselves. Now, this is where zoning gets its reputation for being so boring. There's no video game that simulates the writing of a zoning code, but it's where all of the important stuff is located, so let's dive in and make some sense out of it. The zoning code, or ordinance, contains sections for each of the zones found in the map. Within these sections, there's typically a use table. This table lists all of the permitted uses within each zone. For example, a use table for a commercial zone may have a bakery as an allowed use, but an auto salvage yard is not an allowed use. Many use tables also classify some uses as conditional uses or special uses. These uses aren't allowed outright, but require some consultation and approval from the city government first. It's more of a case-by-case basis situation. After the use table comes the basic development requirements. This means standards for things like building setbacks and side yards, minimum lot sizes, and building heights. Every city has different requirements for their zoning districts. After the use tables and development requirements for each zoning district, most zoning codes will contain impact regulations, or regulations that are not specific to any one zoning district. These often include regulations for signage, parking standards, historic preservation standards, and urban design criteria.
So that's a really quick overview of the zoning code. At this point, you may be thinking to yourself, that all sounds really reasonable. And you know what? You're right, it is reasonable. And that's one of the benefits of zoning. Zoning tries its best to ensure that new development is built in a way that's predictable, reasonable, and minimizes impact to adjacent property owners. It's why city leaders installed zoning codes in many cities over 100 years ago. Zoning ensures that an oil refinery can't be built adjacent to a neighborhood of single-family homes. I think we can all agree that's a pretty worthwhile goal.
Increasingly, however, planners, civic leaders, and community members have begun to question the practice of zoning. For all of its positive aspects, there are quite a few negative qualities too, and I'll list a couple of the biggest ones. First, communities can use zoning codes as a tool of exclusion. Historically, this happened explicitly. Cities would literally write zoning codes that excluded people from districts based on skin color or ethnicity. Now, these were clearly unconstitutional and eventually removed, but these explicit codes gave way to implicit ones that many communities still use today. The most common way to exclude people using the zoning code is by imposing large minimum lot size requirements and other regulations that increase the cost of building a home. If new homes must be built on 1 acre lots or larger, for example, only large expensive homes will be built. This allows cities to become enclaves for the rich at the expense of low and moderate income families. The second major criticism comes from the segregation of uses that I described as a positive before. Segregating uses can also lead to sterile environments and force citizens to travel large distances between different zones for trips to work, school, shopping, and home. Many communities have introduced mixed-use zones that allow for a mixture of residential and commercial uses to mitigate this problem, though mixed-use zones are typically not widespread across zoning maps. Alternatives to traditional single-use zoning, such as form-based codes, aim to reform zoning and move away from the segregation paradigm. Form-based codes regulate the size and shape of buildings instead of their use. So that's zoning in a nutshell. Potentially useful, but probably could be better. How do you make zoning work better in your community? The first step, go to your city's website and find the page for their planning department, sometimes known as the Community Development Department. In most cities, they will post upcoming meetings and town halls. You may get lucky and your community is in the midst of a zoning code revision. These happen rarely, but when they do, it is an excellent opportunity to make your voice heard. You can attend a meeting and give your opinion, send it in to a planning staff or elected official, or write a letter to the editor of your local newspaper. You can tell them to include more mixed-use zones that allow for vibrant, walkable places. If your community isn't going through a zoning code revision, and that's probably the case, you can do many of the same things, but instead you must make a case that the zoning code is in need of a refresh. Your elected officials may not be aware that their zoning code could be better. You could be starting a much-needed conversation in your city.
The bottom line is that if you want great cities, you need a zoning code that makes it perfectly easy and legal to build great development projects. Zoning might sound like a boring place to start, but it literally determines what can and can't be built in your community.
Single-family zoning is really one of the major challenges when we're talking about inequality, and the way that single-family zoning perpetuates that is by creating what are called minimum lot sizes. If you want to live in certain communities, you have to buy about 5,000 to 7,000 square feet of land effectively to live in those neighborhoods, and that's very difficult if you can't afford that. And also, if you want to build anything other than a single family home, you can't do that in 53% of San Diego. So half of the city of San Diego doesn't allow for affordable housing effectively because they don't allow for apartments. We have to really rethink how we're building in our communities, and by forcing the public or anybody to buy a minimum square footage size lot, you're effectively saying you don't want affordable housing or apartments in your neighborhood. I would say that modern zoning maps do reflect our redlining maps that were created in the 1930s. Most major cities have these redlining maps. If you look at them, you can see that the segregation that was embedded in those maps is still in effect today, that the majority of the communities that were zoned for no apartments and for single family only still tend to be wealthier and wider, and the communities that were zoned for apartments tend to be communities of lower income immigrants, low income whites as well, but also low income people of color. And that was the actual intention as well. If you look at the redlining maps and the descriptions that were provided from the federal government, they actually classified and said that there were certain communities out there that were good communities to invest in because there were single family zoning ordinances that were in place in those neighborhoods. So they were very explicit in what they were trying to do, which was to create homogeneous neighborhoods where they actually use the words less infiltration. Everybody should have the opportunity to live somewhere in a decent environment, a safe environment. We also acknowledge that everyone should have the opportunity for home ownership because we know that's important. We have a housing crisis here in California. We have to look at our land differently. We can no longer look at the past and say that that's going to be the future. And the interesting thing about this discussion is it doesn't cost any money. It's really just taking land and looking at it differently and being able to maximize the use of that land. And most importantly too, it provides opportunity for those same communities that were redlined, because now they can buy a piece of land or they can buy a home and they can actually create wealth within their families and pass that wealth along, which is what many families have been doing for generations now. And then in the end of the day, even the homeowners that have these single family homes now will benefit, because they too will now have access to being able to build out their homes for family or others, or sell them off for a profit. This benefits everyone.
In New York City, hundreds of thousands of renters are at risk of eviction, and tens of thousands of homeowners are at risk of foreclosure once the statewide eviction moratorium expires. The number of New Yorkers facing housing insecurity has risen dramatically with the pandemic, and there aren't enough affordable units available for all of them. We're in a housing crisis, but before you can understand that, here's what you need to know about affordable housing. Affordable housing comes in several different forms. One is Section 8 housing. Section 8, also known as the Housing Choice Voucher Program, started in 1978. It provides assistance to some low and moderate income families, allowing them to rent housing in private markets. Families pay up to 40% of their monthly income toward rent, and the program, NYCHA in New York City's case, will pay the remaining amount. NYCHA runs the largest Section 8 program in the country. There are about 85,000 vouchers and 25,000 owners currently participating in the program. The demand is much higher. There are currently 160,000 applicants on the waiting list. Public housing is different from Section 8. Public housing is built to provide affordable rental units for low-income people, the elderly, and those with disabilities. While Section 8 works with the private owners for payment and maintenance, public housing is owned and run directly by the city or state's housing authority. In New York City, a combined total of nearly 600,000 people are living in NYCHA public housing or Section 8 subsidized units. Another option in New York is an affordable housing lottery. People within a wide range of income can apply to win affordable apartments and co-ops. The city provides incentives and tax breaks to developers to set aside a number of units in new buildings to be rented or sold at a lower price. In each lottery, a computer randomly assigns each applicant a number. The lower the number is, the more likely it is that the applicant will be contacted for an affordable apartment. There are also resources that are supposed to help people find more affordable housing, like community-based housing organizations and state-supervised middle-income housing development. But even with these lotteries and resources, the demand for affordable housing outstrips the supply. Check back soon for our next video exploring why it can be difficult to build more.
So good evening and welcome. We are delighted to bring you this Sustainability Housing Forum. It's not, we're not taking any particular positions here, But the purpose of the forum is to give you information about what is and some of the trends that are out there, not just in New York City, but across the country. So if you got here earlier, that little melange or potpourri of videos that we just screened, that's what's out there. And you may have an opinion about the various topics that came up. And we are going to discuss some of those things this evening, but we think that it's important to know not only what is in terms of housing and zoning and in New York City, but what the trends are, what people are thinking about, what's driving some of the conversations that are out there about density and affordable housing and ADUs and the whole range of things that one has heard. And I think that all of us are in neighborhoods where there's something either has gone up, has been put in our neighborhoods that we question why it was there and who allowed it and maybe didn't like what we saw, or where we may be experiencing something now where somebody's trying to create a tower in the middle of your neighborhood. So the point of this forum tonight is to help you not only make sure that everybody understands what's happening, but also how to get involved as members of the community, because we each have a role to play and we each need to make sure that we are we're putting our feet forward and saying, this is what we think, because the community engagement piece is important. So without any further delay, we're going to move forward. I'm introducing Felix Thompson, who is the chairperson of this EQA Sustainability Forum, and he's going to move us into the first section of our meeting. Felix.
Thank you, Barbara. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Sustainable Working Group meeting. I'm Felix Thompson, EQA Chair for the Housing Group. As Barbara said, we're going to basically try to inform you about the basics of what's going on with the city as far as their principal concept of urban design. We want to basically let you know about the different terms that are being bandied about today regarding affordable housing and density, ADUs and TODs. But basically, the more important thing, we want people to start to get involved. Because if the community doesn't get involved and find out what's going on, the city and developers are just going to continue to do what they want to do without our input until it's too late. So with that, we got 5 videos tonight. The first one is going to be about zoning. It's the longest one, it's just over 12 minutes. But before we do that, we want to take a quick poll to get a feel for where people are as far as understanding the different terms and who has responsibility for what regarding land use in our community. So Barbara,
Okay.
start that first poll.
Okay, so the first poll, and you should see it on your screen. What are the 3 main types of land use zones? If you listen carefully, you have the answer to this question. Residential open spaces economic, residential commercial manufacturing, environmental business societal, or residential parks and commercial. What are the 3 types of land use zones, particularly in New York City?
I don't think we see a poll.
So you don't see the poll? Okay, so let me make sure everybody sees the poll. Does everybody see the poll? Okay. So just select your response to item 1. What are the 3 main types of land use zones? Click on your answer. The choices are residential, open spaces, economic. Second choice is residential, commercial, manufacturing. Third choice is environmental, business, societal. Fourth choice is residential, parks, and commercial. I don't see too many answers going up there. Okay, there we go. People are starting to respond. And your answer doesn't, I don't know who's saying what, so just feel free to put in what you think is correct. Okay, so I think, are we there? So the the response to number one, 75% of you think that it's residential, commercial, and manufacturing. And if you chose that, you were right. The second question, what does the term ULURP stand for in the Department of City Planning? And the choices are there: United Land Use Reform Process, Unified Land Utilization Renovation Process, Understanding Land Use Revitalization Procedures, Unified Land Use Review Process. People are clicking in their answers. They're coming in slowly. And the third question in this poll, when should a developer engage a community about his project? And it should say his or her. Before he designs the project, halfway through completion, before he applies for certification, or he doesn't need to do any of those. Okay, so looking at the second question, 52% of you said it's the Unified Land Use Review Process. And if you chose that answer, you are correct. And for number three, when should a developer engage a community? There's probably no right, well, there's a right answer in terms of what the community thinks. And I see that 76% of you did say that before he designs the project, because too often people come into our communities with a project that's designed and we don't hear from them until it's going through a process to get permission. So thank you for taking the poll, and I'm going back to Felix.
Thank you, Barbara. Okay, so with that, we're going to start with the first video. Again, it's at just a little over 12 minutes long, so stay with us and we'll come back after it's done. The first video is called What is Zoning?
What is zoning? I'm George Fontaine and I'm an architect in New York, and I want to talk about what zoning means in architecture, development, and urban planning. Zoning is a set of regulations that determine the use and bulk for buildings. Use will determine what goes where, and bulk is the general shape and size of a building. Before we get started, don't forget to hit the like button, hit subscribe if you want to see more videos like this, and leave comments below. Let me know if there are any questions or topics you want to discuss in the future. Zoning breaks up a city into different zoning districts. Every zoning district has its unique set of rules as to what you can build there, what type of uses are allowed, and then bulk regulations, how tall you can build. So certain areas you can build residential only, certain areas you can build commercial and manufacturing. You don't want to have a single family house and somebody builds a nightclub right outside. We keep these things separate, and that's done through zoning. Okay, so in New York City, which is what I'm going to be following here in this outline, all different cities are going to have something like this, but there might be a lot of nuance. We have three general zoning districts. C, M, and R. They're commercial, manufacturing, and residential. All right. The commercial districts are obviously meant for commercial uses. In New York, you can build residential in most commercial districts. We have manufacturing uses, and you have a lot of restrictions as to what type of commercial uses. And then you have residential zones, which don't really allow any commercial uses unless they have what's called a commercial overlay. There are overlay districts, which adds a secondary use on top of a use. So you might have a primarily residential use neighborhood with a commercial overlay, which means you can have certain commercial uses there with restrictions. Aside from the basic zoning districts, you have special purpose districts. So there's lots of different neighborhoods that have a special purpose district, like the Midtown zoning district in Manhattan is a very specific zoning district. There's the downtown Manhattan zoning district. There's natural area districts in Riverdale and Staten Island. There's all sorts of different special districts that have very special rules that can supersede the underlying district rules. So the underlying district would be the commercial, manufacturing, or residential district, and then a special purpose district is kind of on top of that, setting up additional rules. And then you have buildings that are designated as community facility. There is no community facility zoning district, okay? In New York City, community facility buildings are allowed in most zoning districts. There are restrictions in certain ones. They're not allowed in every one, but in a lot of them. And community facility buildings, so if they're allowed in a residential district, there'll be special regulations for bulk of a community facility building and, you know, all sorts of restrictions. So the zoning use is set up into use groups. Okay, every single use of a building has a different use group. So use group 1 is a single family house. Use group 2 could be multifamily. Use group 3 and 4 community facilities. Use group 6 is commercial. Okay, so the zoning districts tell you which use groups are allowed in different areas. And that's how city planning determines what type of buildings go in what locations. Aside from use, zoning also dictates bulk. So bulk is the general shape and size of a building, okay? Every zoning district is gonna have different rules. So in Midtown Manhattan, you can build a really tall high-rise skyscraper, but in a residential neighborhood in Queens, you're gonna be restricted to much lower heights on construction. So the bulk is the general shape and size of what you can build. It's going to dictate things like if it's residential, lot size and lot area and width. So this is how wide can a lot be. If you want to subdivide a lot in half, okay, there's minimum sizes of what they can be. One big zoning bulk regulation is FAR. This is floor area ratio. It's pronounced FAR, not FAR, okay? Professionals always say FAR. Floor area ratio is a calculation that determines how many square feet a building can be. The total square footage for an entire building, when you add up all the floor area of all the floors, what's the total building square footage? That's called FAR, or floor area ratio. We have another video explaining floor area ratio. I'll put a link in the description below. Floor area ratio is the rule that will really determine the size of the building as far as square footage is concerned. Okay, if it's a residential building, density, how many apartments can you have there? This is referred to as the DU factor. I usually just call it density. It's how many apartments. This is a calculation based on the floor area ratio. So you can't just put as many apartments as you like. There's a specific set number of apartments that can go into a building based on the floor area ratio and the density factor, and then you do the formula, and that determines you can do, 30 apartments in this building or whatever it is. Zoning will also determine yard regulations. Okay, there could be a minimum dimension for rear yards, front yards, side yards. For example, residences in New York typically have a 30-foot rear yard. Commercial buildings have a 20-foot rear yard. Not all districts are going to require side yards or front yards. Some do, some don't. Okay, so your yard regulations, that means you cannot build in the required rear yard. If you have a 30-foot required rear yard for a residential building, you can build in here, in this area. You can't build beyond that point. So it determines these distances where you can and cannot build. All right, it's also going to determine distances between two buildings sometimes. Okay, certain zoning districts say, two houses can't be closer than this together. Or if you have a development with multiple buildings, there can be regulations about how far these different buildings can be spaced together. Can buildings be butt up against each other? Can two buildings touch each other? Can you block your neighbor's wall? These are all things that are in the zoning code that'll determine, where the building can sit on the property in relation to the property lines and in relationship to the neighboring buildings. Of course, zoning code regulates the building height. What's the maximum building height? This is determined in lots of different ways. So in certain zoning districts in New York, for example, if you're using the quality housing program, which it's actually just a set of bulk regulations, okay? Buildings are determined by a building height and a base height, okay? So this can regulate the requirement for setbacks, which is very normal in New York. You'll see lots of buildings in New York have a setback. That's where the top of the building is in from the street, okay? This is meant to let light in. If you've ever been in downtown Manhattan, some of these older streets, you're gonna see that they're really dark, very claustrophobic, no light gets in. That's why we have zoning codes today, because people could just build whatever they wanted, and it kind of didn't turn out to be so great for city planning. So they created rules for setbacks, and buildings have to go back to allow light into the street at a certain elevation. There's lots of different ways that setbacks are determined in the zoning code. Sometimes it's by a base height, which just says at a certain height you need a setback, but sometimes it's by a sky exposure plane, which is an imaginary plane that your building cannot penetrate. In some cases, like Midtown Manhattan has a setback curve, which is literally a kind of curving plane that you cannot penetrate. There's lots of different ways. Some zoning districts in New York have no building height regulation, meaning you can build as tall as you want. There's still a sky exposure plane or a curve, okay, that you can't penetrate, which will eventually cut off your building. But some of them, like tower regulations, you can really build as tall as you want, as long as you don't exceed the floor area ratio. So one thing about zoning is that I always describe is zoning is a balancing act, okay? You have to balance all these things. So if you have a zoning district with R10 zoning and you're doing tower on a base zoning and the tower can really go as tall as you want, well, at some point you're gonna run out of FAR. So it's not just that one rule determines what you can build there. People will call me all the time saying, I have a property, I wanna know how many stories I can build. It's a much more complicated question than just to say, okay, you can build 6 stories here. It depends on what you're doing. If you have a zoning district where multiple uses are permitted, okay, sometimes each use will actually have their own different bulk regulations. So if you do residential, you can do one thing, but if you do a community facility, it's something completely different. Zoning will also determine things like parking. Are you required to have parking? Maybe you're not. The Manhattan core in New York City doesn't require any parking if you're in certain community districts in Manhattan. Okay, plazas, things like that are going to be in zoning code. Some areas you're not allowed to have a plaza. In some cases, plazas will give you a zoning bonus. Okay, there's lots of bonuses and incentives in the zoning code saying if you do this, you get a bonus. For example, if you provide a plaza or an arcade in front of a building, you can get a square footage bonus, an FAR bonus to your building to make a larger building, but you have to create a public plaza at the owner's expense. And this has to be maintained to the public, during reasonable hours and things like this. And these can be incentives. New York City has an inclusionary housing program, which is one huge incentive program that if you do mixed income, right? If you do a certain percentage of units that are affordable units, then you get more square footage for your building. So it kind of helps both parties. The developer gets more square footage for his building, and then the city gets a handful of affordable units in a building that otherwise would be for more expensive apartments. One important thing to know about codes is that you have to comply with all of them. So there are zoning codes determine what you can build, okay? What type of use, what's the general size, what can you build? But then there's also building codes which determine how you can build. That's a completely different set of codes, okay? The building codes is written by the Department of Buildings. Zoning codes are written by the Department of City Planning. Zoning codes are being updated all the time, especially in New York. There are amendments constantly being published. These are meant to improve the urban fabric of the city. Some zoning codes are incredibly strict and, in my opinion, overdo it a little bit. There are a lot of restrictions. People are always calling me saying, I want to build a multifamily building on my property. And I say, you can't do that. And they're like, what do you mean? I can't build whatever I want on your property? No, you cannot. Okay. The city has a lot of rules about what you can build on your property. And they also have a lot of rules on how you build on your property. Because zoning code regulates so many issues, so many use requirements, bulk regulations that determine the shape and size of the building, one of the first steps for an architect to look into when a client is planning a development is to do a zoning analysis very early on in the process and determine generally what is allowed here. How big of a building can you do? What's the general shape and size? So you can determine what is a game plan. And this is one of the most important constraints in property development within any city. Buildings that comply 100% with all the zoning regulations are referred to as of right buildings. That means you're 100% in accordance with all these rules. There are ways to sometimes get special permits or zoning variances or do rezoning in order to build outside of the regulations. It's pretty rare, relatively speaking, and very complicated, but normally most buildings are developed as of right. So the key point of zoning is that it regulates what you can build as far as the use of the building and the general shape and size. Thank you for listening.
Okay. All right, so we have another quick video coming up. It won't be too long, it's just over 2 minutes. And it's going to explain the ULURP process, something we just talked about. So when you're ready, we'll begin. What is ULURP?
New Yorkers know that every neighborhood has its own look and feel. The buildings themselves can be very different in different areas, from tall office buildings to apartment buildings, to small family homes to industrial buildings. New York City has zoning rules that regulate the types of buildings that can be built on a given piece of land. These rules exist to protect the health, safety, and welfare of everyone in the city, and provide the space needed for its residents and businesses. If a property owner wants to repurpose a building or build a new one that meets the existing zoning rules, they must get a building permit from the Department of Buildings. But what happens if a property owner wants to change existing zoning rules for their property? And how do zoning rules get updated to meet evolving needs and priorities? Public and private property owners and civic groups may submit applications to change land use rules. New York City has a process called ULURP, or the Uniform Land Use Review Procedure, for city officials, agencies, and the public to formally review and make decisions about these applications. ULURP is designed to give voice to local priorities and balance these with citywide needs, such as affordable housing and job growth. There are multiple opportunities for New Yorkers to give input along the way. Before ULURP starts, applicants should collaborate with the local communities early and often to ensure their proposed changes align with community aspirations. Let's walk through the steps in the ULURP process now. The process is triggered by something called certification. This means the city certifies that the land use application is complete and ready for public review. You'll hear that the following steps in public review each have strict deadlines to ensure a consistent, transparent, and predictable process. The community surrounding the proposal site gets the first formal voice in the process. The local community board or community boards have 60 days to hold a public hearing and provide an official recommendation about the application. The community board may suggest modifications to the proposal. ULURP then provides the local borough president 30 days to hold a public hearing and make a recommendation for or against approval. The borough president may also recommend modifications. Next, the City Planning Commission has 60 days to hold a public hearing and vote for or against the project. They review the recommendations from community boards and borough presidents as well as input from the public and consider these in light of broader issues facing the city, such as the need for affordable housing. If the commission approves the proposal, it is then reviewed by the City Council, which has 50 days to hold public hearings and then vote on the application. If approved, the zoning rule changes are put on the books. Here's how to stay informed about applications you can provide feedback on. Visit the zoning application portal at zap.planning.nyc.gov to search for projects in your neighborhood or across the city. You can register to speak at any upcoming City Planning Commission hearing by visiting nyc.gov/engage. Written testimony can also be submitted.
All right, thank you. So with that, we have our first panelist, who is Michael Mallier, and he is the Land Use Chair for Community Board 13. What we're going to do is we're going to take questions from the audience, and if you have a question, you can either use the raise your hand function, or you can type your question in the chat. Any questions from Mr. Mallier so far?
There was a lot said, so I know somebody must have a question or a
I was
comment.
trying to unmute myself.
Okay, Patrick, thank you.
Hi, Mr. Michael Mallier. How are you? Welcome.
Patrick.
My question is, what is the best way in which the community can be really informed, like, of a ULURP process, especially when it pretends to be a controversial process, property or development, and we know it goes through the community board, it goes to the borough president, it goes that line, but a lot of times the community feel that they were in the blind, they didn't know about it. What do you suggest is the best way that the community, the local community, can get notice of something like this?
All right. Well, really, the only way you can know is to go to that ZAP website that they had mentioned, and basically it'll have blue dots of all of the potential ULURPs that are going on in the neighborhood around you. So if there's a blue dot near your home, you click on that, and it'll tell you what they're proposing at that site. Other than that, there's really no other way you would know about it unless it came to the community board, or really that would be it. So those are the two ways. You either it would come to the community board, or you can find.
And I'd just like to piggyback on that,
website.
To ask, when does the elected officials for those areas know? Do they know? Do they get some type of inside heads up about these projects before it goes to ZAP, or as soon as it goes to ZAP? When do our elected officials know?
It really depends on if the developer reached out to the elected official prior to getting the certification for the ULURP. It happens frequently that they do, but it's different in every case. I know there's one case in Community Board 13 where a development on Guy R. Brewer, where the developer did reach out to certain individuals prior to the certification, and so that the elected officials were aware of the project before the community board was.
So, do we have any other questions? I do have, yes.
Yes. I'm sorry, my hand.
All right, Carly, if you have a question, use the raise your hand function.
Yes, I forgot to do that. I'm going to raise my hand. My question is about parking, because you know, when you build a building and it's more than 2 stories or 3 stories, parking always becomes an issue. And the development of this building, do they ever take into account to maybe make a parking garage below these buildings? Because we know progress is not going to stop. Eventually,
right. So
more high-rise buildings are going to come into the community.
All right. And other than being the land use chair, I am also an architect. So I do design a lot of buildings, and providing parking under a building is extremely expensive. The underpinning involved, just the sheer excavation is an expensive endeavor. So the way we usually design a building is that we will go right. Usually there are waivers for parking. In some developments, it could be 15 or less, or so. If you need half a car for each apartment, we will design to 30 apartments so we meet the waiver of the parking requirements, so we do not have to provide parking. So that's the way developers get around providing parking, is they'll design to the waiver where you do not need to provide parking. But there are instances like in residential, in one family residential, where you can't get around parking, that you have to provide it. But as far as doing, underground parking, it is extremely expensive.
And I know that's our issue with too many, more people in the community. You need more parking.
Right.
Right. So I see Felipe Ruiz and then Ashley Coulter. Felipe?
Thank you, Madam President, and to all members. It's been a tremendous amount of information. If I'm in a very humble position here, extremely intimidating in that it's a tremendous amount of data, quite intimidating to digest. To my point, though, regarding the single-family homes to a two-family home conversions, precisely what happened. What is not clear to members in my block association and the surrounding areas, we're concerned over this particular trend in the neighborhood. What has occurred? What were the conditions that had allowed for any speculator in developing real estate in the neighborhood to come in and to convert a single family home to a two-family home and then create conditions that are not quite favorable? If any of the panels could answer that question. Thank you, Madam President.
Okay, I'll take a shot at that. So generally in Community Board 13, most of our single family zones are zoned for single family, meaning that they're either R1 or R2. When you get to R3, then that permits two family homes. But in the condition where you're in an R2, a lot of these houses are being legally converted to two family houses. So it really depends on the zoning district that you're in. So unfortunately, if you're in a district that permits it and it's as of right, then the developer can build it as of right. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you. Ashley Coulter?
Yes. Hi, good evening, everyone. I have a question. Now that, you see the buildings that are being built in an area where, as opposed to, say, one residential building, you have 4, 5, 6, 7 in an area, and they offer a multitude of apartments and commercial buildings as well. What is actually being done about the power grid? Because if the power grid isn't being evaluated, how will we be able to avoid blackouts during the summertime?
Well, that's an excellent question. And National Grid had concerns about this, and they were proposing a pipeline under the East River, like from New Jersey into New York, which the EPA would not let them do. So they put a moratorium on new gas back, it was over a year ago. And since then, the governor made them lift it. But, providing power is a problem, and it's going to continue to be a problem. And now in the governor's new bill, there's a proposal that starting next year, all new developments are entirely electric without gas. So they're just trying to wean us off of fossil fuels and towards electricity. But still, the infrastructure for the electricity does need to be improved dramatically.
Definitely. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. And we're going to take, I guess, 2 more questions. I see 2 hands up here. Patrick, you have another question, and then Gloria Childs.
I'll let Gloria go before me.
Okay, Gloria.
Okay, good evening, everyone, and thank you for all the information you've shared this evening. So I'd like to understand the ULURP process a little better. And when a developer comes into a community and decides that this is the community where he or she wants to build something that's outside of the zoning constraints. What really does that ULURP process consider when in making a decision about whether or not to allow that developer to go forward? Are they looking at infrastructure in the community that can accommodate this new building? Are they looking at quality of life and parking and other environmental issues that could impact the people who currently live in the community? Are they looking to see if this is the best place for development like this, or if there might be others? What's that ULURP process looking at? As those people make decisions about, a rezoning request. I think you're on mute. Michael, you're on mute.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. Okay, so I'm not 100% an expert on ULURP, but I do know that they do an environmental impact study prior to their certification. And if there's a red flag that comes up during that initial environmental study, then they will do a full-fledged environmental impact study, which is a lengthy process that they go through. But that doesn't happen quite often. Usually they just do a broad stroke environmental impact study, and they don't take into consideration parking and things of that nature. So to answer your question, it's that they don't study it as well as they should.
Okay, thank you. And the last question, I think, Patrick Evans.
And Barbara, got one more question after Patrick from.
I just wanted to ask Michael, when something comes to you and your committee, what steps do you take to ascertain whether this project is appropriate for the community, and what outreach do you do to the immediate affected areas to get some kind of guidance on how that area would feel about this project that you're considering?
Right. So when the ULURP does come to the community board, the land use committee is the first to hear about it. So we'll get a presentation by the developer, and from that presentation, we will determine whether or not this has a negative impact on the community, and who should know. So then once we say, oh, this is going to be a big building and people should know about it, then we try to reach out to the surrounding civics and let them know what's going on. And we try to arrange for the developer to have meetings with these civics to try to explain the development. And more often than not, the civics don't want it, and rightfully so. But that's the way it's usually steered from the land use committee.
Okay, thank you. And you said there's a question in the chat?
Yes, from Norman Jones. Mr. Jones?
Yeah, the chat, it says, what is freehold? And can you describe the difference between that and leasehold?
That I cannot answer that question. I don't know.
Okay.
Okay, so that's no problem. We could follow maybe the other guests.
Yeah. And I would just, I guess, if there are no other questions, I would just ask Michael if, you heard what those two little video clips that we played. Is there anything that you would add, or anything that you disagreed with, or any words of wisdom that you want to leave with us at this point?
Actually, I thought he did a very good job of explaining a very complicated subject. There are nuances to every bit of those, FAR and the sky exposure planes. They in every district you go into, there are different manications of that you can follow. So, but I think overall they did a good job of explaining it. They probably could have went a little further on ULURP. I don't know if any of you were on the community board training that they did earlier in the month, and they had a more extensive ULURP presentation, which I can forward to Barbara if she wants to make it available to other people.
Okay, thank you. Felix, back to you.
All right, thank you, Barbara. All right, so in the next part of our program, we had sent out a link for everyone who registered to view this movie called Community by Design, where members of communities across the United States and Canada showed how they got involved in planning out their community. And to lead that discussion will be LaTanya Collins to open up the discussion. LaTanya?
Thank you, Felix. Yes, there was a link for The Ways That We Live, Community by Design. And I thought it was a wonderful film. And what it does is it explores the role that design plays in community. And we had the opportunity to see particular neighborhoods and really listen to some of the progressive thinkers of that time. We looked at Murray's Corner, The Crossing, and an area in Vancouver called Garden Drive. And there were a few questions, and the first question was, how were communities involved or engaged in the projects? There was a second question, why might that involvement have contributed to the seemingly success of the project, and do any of the projects make sense for New York? So the first question, how were the communities in the film involved or engaged in the project? Just to lead that discussion, one of the things that, I'll share first, I saw that in the film, the community took a very active part in the planning process. And I just want to open it up for discussion for anyone else who'd like to share in regards to that guiding question, who did happen to see this innovative film. How were the communities involved or engaged in some of those projects that we saw?
Excuse me, LaTanya, what was the question again?
So in the film, The Ways We Live, Communities by Design, we got the opportunity to take a look at several communities and how they were innovative in design and exploring the roles that community plays in the development. So the question is, how were those communities involved, or how were they engaged in the planning projects?
Thank you. That's very insightful question, because when I move around my community of Southeast Queens, Springfield Gardens, I see land that is available, or open land that might be, I would say, underutilized, because they're not utilizing as a park, or they're not utilizing it as a wild space. It's just there. And a lot of times it picks up garbage and debris, abandoned cars, somehow get into these deep pockets of these lands. And I always wonder, like, what can we imagine for that, for those spots? And one of the places I think of always is like around Locust Manor Railroad Station. There's this open space that runs the length of, right outside the station, going all the way down to Baisley. And it's a lot of land. It's just going undeveloped. Not that we need another apartment building, but we can definitely utilize that land for something, but then someone will come in afterwards and make a decision about it. And I was wondering, how can the community be proactive and make a decision about it?
Yeah. And, it seemed in that film that they were groups of people who either were pulled together by a designer, or they came together because they had a felt need that something needed to be done. So I think, Patrick's point is good. I think that we, as people in the community, need to take it upon ourselves to say, well, we need to do something about that. Like there's a park called Mentone Park it has nothing on it. It's right alongside the railroad trestle on North Conduit. It's I saw people are dumping in it. There are all kinds of things happening with it. And nobody has done anything about that for the last 50 years. Yet recently something was proposed for it and the people said, no, they didn't want it. Well, the question is, if you don't want something, then what can you do as a community to come together to do something about it? So there is a need for a community to get engaged and involved in the things that are going on in the neighborhood.
Absolutely. And you know what? Those are some of the things that we actually saw in the film. People came prepared, the community members came prepared with insight, and they came prepared with their ideas in the planning process. So we see that happening in the film in each of the communities, how they took part and said, well, this is an area that we'd like to see certain things. We'd like to have a garden. So they were instrumental in the planning process. And I think that's really how they were mostly engaged in the film. Thank you. Thank you, Patrick.
Yeah. And we have 3 people who want to contribute. Ashley Coulter, and then Michael Malia, and there's a phone number here, 929 something. Ashley.
Yes, hi. What way could a person, because, at the end of the day, I'm in Southeast Queens. I'm right off of Merritt Boulevard. And, you watch your community and there's so much potential that you see. Yet we don't take advantage of it until we see someone else come in and view that potential and becomes proactive. So how can we enact people in our own community to become proactive? Because I feel personally, at the end of the day, if you lay your head here, you should care about where you live. You should care about your community. Mm-hmm. And you should want to see everybody succeed. So how can we as a community get on one accord and try to see everything flourish the way it could possibly?
That's an excellent question. And just going back to the film, you were able to really see the community take part, getting involved in the planning, bringing their insight, bringing their ideas and their suggestions. So it wasn't really it wasn't an intrusive thing. It was more so a collaborative process in the planning. So, if I could try to answer that question, I would say just to be as involved as possible. And keeping ideas and being prepared to share your own insights on the way that you would like the community to look and to feel.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, because California they were definitely proactive.
Yeah.
And how it looked, and it was beautiful. Mm-hmm. Like to see the unity among the community.
Exactly. So Michael Malia.
Okay, so what I just wanted to mention, when you were mentioning that there are places in the neighborhood that you think that you might want to have a say in the development, there's a process called a 197A, where the community can put forth something similar to a ULURP to try to develop parcels of land. Mm-hmm. I just want to let everyone be aware that I put a link in the chat to the rules of that. But that's called the 197A, and you should be aware of it.
Great, thank you, Michael.
Okay.
And I would say to Ms. Coulter, sometimes if you see something that needs to be done, maybe just mentioning it to your neighbor or 2 or 3 people and saying, well, what can we do here? Sometimes that's a way of gathering of launching a project. you get 2 or 3 of people of like minds, and if they are really enthusiastic and passionate about something, then they can move it along. I see 1929, the person whose phone number is 1929. 39.
That's me. Hello, my name is Alexis Foote. And,
Okay.
I live in Far Rockaway, and I've been doing land advocacy for over 6 years since Hurricane Sandy. And from my experience, you can't have the naysayers discourage you. So if people are saying, "Oh, I don't want this and I don't want that," well, then there has to be something there, because we can't keep letting the kids see this area in a plight, right? And so right now we're fighting for a CLT in Edgemere. Well, rather, I just submitted a proposal with Hester Street, Take Root Justice, and Professor Banshee from the Architect School of the City College, and David Figman from David Corinne from Figment. And so we have put in a RFEI with HPD to take over 116 lots to do economic development and home ownership. So what I say to you guys is that to make sure that you're on the HPD website, looking at all these different RFPs, RFIPs, because this is how these developers are getting this land, right? They're applying for these proposals and they're getting them, right? So if you are trying to become stewards of land, I would just say make sure you're on the Queensborough President's Land Use, go to those meetings, stay engaged with the community board, because that's how you know what else is also going on with the land. I also started a community garden out here in Far Rockaway. It was an HPD lot. It was vacant. It was garbage and trash thrown on it. And it took me over 6 years to get this lot, because I had so many doors closed in my face. And because I would not take no for an answer, we became a garden in 2019. And I handed over the garden to the homeowners and the residents in that area, because my goal was to build people power, to get power over these lots, because I'm a big advocate of home ownership. And not only that, but I'm also trying to grow cannabis in Far Rockaway and start a workers cooperative. So that's what I say to you guys. Just don't take no for an answer. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for your work. Awesome. Awesome things. Any more questions in regards to the first guiding question that we had? How can communities stay involved or be engaged? Okay, and in addition to that, we had another question, why might that involvement have contributed to the seeming success of the project? And, if I would just go first, I saw in the film where they were actually welcoming some of the high density projects that were occurring, but also making sure that they had solid input on how the union would move forward. So again, question number 1 and question number 2, they both center around engagement in the community. And then we had a third question in regards to the film. Do any of the projects make sense for New York? And might any of the scenarios be doable in our city or in Southeast Queens? Any responses to that for those who watched the film? How can we make a comparison between what we saw and what we can bring about into our own communities?
I think that video was great. I think it was amazing. And even when one of the people in the video was like, "Oh, I didn't think this was gonna work," and then when it actually happened, she's like, "It's like the best thing, right?" So it was the best thing since sliced bread. So I think you guys in Southeast Queens need to start the process of whatever it is that you're gonna do, so that way the naysayers can get engaged. Or like, you know how you sent the video, you guys should have like a movie night during the summer, right? And one of the parks and start doing door knocking, because that's what I've been doing out here in Far Rockaway. Not everybody's on social media, and for me, with the garden and the CLT and trying to get people to join, I had to literally knock on every door, go to the projects and knock on the doors over there. So it's really about doing grassroots organizing, like how they did in the civil rights movement with the freedom ride and everything. Like, we have to go back to that. We have to go back to the freedom ride and start getting our young people in, because they're dying, right? And they're not getting any generational wealth. So the key to that is also getting the teenagers and the young people involved in, like, what do you want your home to look like? Because that's the problem. Nobody's asking them, what do you want to do, right? Because we're all living by that. Kids are supposed to be seen and not heard. And that's failing our kids. They need to be seen and they need to be heard, because that's how we got all this going. The freedom riders were people in their 20s saying, I'm sick of this happening. How can we make change? And those were the ones that were at the counter getting beaten, getting the dog sicked on them. So we need to involve and engage our young people. And I say that because my son is 16 and I've been having him involved since Hurricane Sandy. Okay, thank you for letting me share, you guys. Have a blessed day.
Well, before you go, there's a lot of comments in the chat. So, and we don't really know who you are. We just see the telephone number. So if you could just connect with us, I can hear all of your passion, and we would love to continue the conversation and connect with you, even after.
So my name is, yes, I'm sorry. So my name is, I was Alexis Smallwood, but then I got married. So I'm Alexis Foote. My email address is AlexisSmallwood83@gmail.com. My number is 929-393-1862. And you can email me and call me. I would love to give a tour of the garden and show where we were. I just got 4 additional lots to the garden that had took over 4 years. And the way that happened was Bill Tompkinson from Green Thumb, his wife got a job in London, and off he goes. So God does answer prayers. Trust me, he does. It may not be how we want it, but it will get done. And so now Carlos Martinez is the deputy commissioner of Green Thumb, and he finally released those 4 lots that I had been waiting for like the past 3 years, right? So not only is it going out there and doing the work, but it's also praying to our Father God above, talking to Mother Nature and talking to the ancestors and saying, if this is for us, let it be for us. And really putting it in the government's ears about reparations, right? Because the land that we're talking about belonged to the Native Americans, and they were colonized. So we need to also keep that in mind, that everything we're doing is about reparations and getting our 40 acres and a mule back.
That's excellent. I think we have a comment from Patrick Evans, and I think we can then wind up.
Absolutely.
I want to tag on to that energy of Alexis. There are some issues that we have to balance in our community. Development, the commercial enterprises that are right in our community, especially right here in Southeast Queens, down in the Brookville, Springfield Gardens community, Rosedale, where we have all of that activity that is centered around JFK. And it brings ancillary businesses like the trucking industry. We get all of that. And, we have these things to balance, and we have to balance our living in these environments. And with that said, some of these lands, it's like we complain about the trucks in our community, and they park right in our quiet blocks, commercial vehicles overnight. And with all of that, again, we have to re-envision, how do we balance and how do we solve all of these myriad of issues? And like that Locust Manor area, I can envision a temporary. And sometimes people don't like you said, Alexis, people don't like what you want to do when you're being proactive, but I can envision that land being a temporary holding spot to tow these rigs. But somebody's like, no, not here. But we got to balance things. And it's a lot of land out there. It's right by the railroad, but people will say, no, don't do nothing with it if you're gonna do that with it. But like you said, Alexis, you have to be proactive, and I think it may not be the best solution, but it is something to stave off some of our other issues.
Yeah, and it's community that has to come together.
Right.
So I may seem like I'm rushing you along because we have more
Yes,
programs.
this has been a rich conversation, but we are going to move along for the rest of the program. Thank you for your contributions. And Felix, back to you.
Yeah, and I would say anybody who hasn't seen the film, you have until midnight. So if the conversation here sparked your curiosity, you can go to that link that you were given and see the film. It's only a 25, 30-minute film. So you have until midnight to see it. Felix, yes.
Well, thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Latanya, for that. All right, so speaking of community engagement, we're going to show a quick video, only 2 minutes long, but it fits into what we're just talking about. So next video is going to be community engagement.
What is community engagement? At its simplest level, community engagement is bringing together people around a shared idea, such as education, healthcare, land development, transportation, and housing. Community engagement is at the heart of representative democracy. It is the process of building relationships with neighborhood residents and interested parties who will work side by side with each other as an ongoing partner, building an army of support for a community project with the end goal of making the neighborhood a better place to live. With community engagement, you're bringing together residents with local business, city officials, developers, media, and nonprofits. Normally, this would be a messy, time-consuming, expensive, and difficult task. But the understanding and the trust that it builds is worth the expenditure. Putting a community online eliminates these 4 issues, but it doesn't replace face-to-face interaction. It just starts the conversation, particularly with people who have privacy or trust issues. That's why City Chatter starts the conversation.
Okay. Before we go to our next guest, we have another quick poll for you to answer. There's a couple of questions. Barbara? Barbara, you there?
Here, I'm pulling up the poll. 1 second. Hold on. Okay. So this is the third poll, poll number 3, yes. Okay, so poll number 3. Which of the good urban design principles do you think are most important? And there are 5 listed. Reinforces and creates a sense of place. Urban design opens, accessible to everyone, and is inclusive. It pays attention to details. It provides a sense of comfort, or it honors community values, culture, and mores. So the 5 choices there: reinforces and creates a sense of place, open, accessible to everyone, and inclusive. It pays attention to detail, provides a sense of comfort, or urban design honors community values, culture, and mores. And there are no right or wrong answers, but we wanted to get a sense of what you think. And our guest speakers will have an idea of where you're coming from. And the second part of that, the second piece, before we show you the results, who are the best persons to design community land use projects? The city of urban planners and architects, city or urban planners and architects, local developers, community members, I don't know. So we'll take another half a minute. Not seeing any more answers going up. I'm going to end the poll. And I see a couple of people changing their minds. Okay, and I'm going to share the results with you. So 42% said that urban design reinforces and creates a sense of place. 63% of you seem to feel that it should be open, accessible to everyone, and inclusive. 32% pays attention to detail. 21% provides a sense of comfort, and 79% honors communities, values, culture, and mores. And there was no, I think that's more than 100%, but anyway, we'll debate the poll, people.
It is. I'm an accountant and numbers go with me.
Okay, and so the second question said,
well, what it was is that you could choose more than one.
Oh, okay, thanks, Gloria.
Yeah, in this, the way that, yeah.
Okay, yeah, because it was supposed to be multiple choice. So, and the second one, but that's good for the our speakers to know. Who are the best persons to design community and land use projects? 37% said city or urban planners, 26% said local developers, 63% said community members, and a bunch of you are not sure. So thank you for answering the poll, and Felix, back to you.
Thank you. All right, so our next guest is Mr. Brian Graff, and let me tell you a little bit about him. He is currently an architect and professor of urban design and former dean of the School of Constructed Environments at the Parsons School of Design. He has devoted his career to public and service role of architecture as a New York-based architect since 1981, and is the founding director of an urban design consultancy called Urban Interface LLC in Newark, New Jersey since 2001. He retired from practice in 2021 and is currently living in Putnam Valley, New York. Mr. McGrath has served as a principal investigator in the Baltimore Ecosystem Study, long-term ecological research, where he led the Urban Design Working Group for 10 years. He currently serves as an associate director of the Tishman Center of Environment and Design at the New School. Mr. McGrath is here to talk about architecture and urban design. Mr. McGrath, it's on you.
Yeah, thanks, Felix. That was a really great introduction. And thank you, Barbara, for inviting me here. I'm going to quickly pass the baton to Adam Levinsky, my friend and colleague and an urban planner, and let him present first because I know his time is limited. He actually has to leave earlier.
Sure.
Okay.
Before, Ms. Malia mentioned something about 197A, and Mr. Levinsky is an expert in that field, so it's a nice segue. Mr. Levinsky, welcome.
Great. Thank you so much, Felix. And it's great to be here. I've been online for about 40 minutes so far, and it's really been fantastic to listen in. I love the way this forum's been organized. So once again, thank you for inviting me. Just very quickly on my background, I am a managing principal and partner at a firm called WXY Studio. We are a group of urban planners, urban designers, and architects based in the city. I'm also a professor of practice at Columbia University, and I have a PhD in planning and a master's in architecture. And I've had a particular interest in community-based planning. Had the good fortune to be involved in Eastern Queens in the past as well. After Hurricane Sandy, our firm was very involved in the Rockaways. We worked on the redesign of the boardwalk. And as part of that, we did a master plan for the parks in the Rockaways. A lot of that work is being carried out now. And I'm currently working a lot with a group called RISE on resiliency issues with the ShoreCore youth team there. So really, I think there's a lot of very significant, important issues in the Rockaways and in the Eastern Queens. And certainly, I think there'll be a lot arising, in this next mayoral administration about future of Eastern Queens. And so today, I wanted to really start with a presentation of work that I was involved with about 5 years ago in East Harlem, which was a neighborhood plan. And in some ways, I offer it as a little bit of an alternative to 197A planning. 197A plans have been led by community boards, but have not been produced so much in the last few years. And one of the challenges with 197A plans is they lack a statutory tooth to them. And so, really getting the city to abide by 197A plan issues has been a challenge in the past. And so I will present the East Harlem Neighborhood Plan. I'm going to see if I'm able to share my screen. And if you give me one moment, I will pull this up. So is everybody able to see my screen?
Yes.
Great. So this work was conducted and completed in 2017. WXY Studio was brought on board by the City Council land use group to facilitate the process, but we also worked alongside Hester Street Collaborative, and I heard their name come up earlier, and they were funded through the Neighborhood First Fund, which is a conglomerate of foundations who supported that process. We were funded through the City of New York. So clearly, how these processes are organized and funded, and managed is a critical component of their success. And so before I really take you through the East Harlem Neighborhood Plan, I wanted to just kind of introduce and put up a graphic that shows what the typical rezoning process looks like. And I know that before I joined, you were talking a bit about ULURP and rezoning. And I think what's important to see in this context is that, essentially in New York City, we have a system where zoning is there and in place. And if developers meet the rules of that zoning, they can do as of right zoning. And when there's change to the zoning, there's a land use application. And that is done either by a developer or sometimes by the city. And it comes with a fairly limited amount of public input at the beginning. And then it goes through a series of processes, including the community board, all the way through to the city council, which really has the final say. And so, as many of you will know, your local city council person is a critical person in that process. And so what we wanted to do was really reshape that idea of a rezoning and start it with something that was more of a comprehensive neighborhood plan, something that didn't look just at zoning and land use issues, but really was more holistic. And to assume that that would be accepted and used as the basis for land use applications going forward. And so what happened in East Harlem was a quite interesting example where, in essence, the mayor of New York, and sorry about that, the mayor of New York, de Blasio at the time, had announced that he was going to rezone several neighborhoods in New York as part of his affordable housing plan. And East Harlem was slated to become one of the first of those neighborhoods. But before the Department of City Planning got started, the city council person and the community board essentially stepped in and said, hold on, we want to do a neighborhood plan first. And we want that neighborhood plan to be the basis of the Department of City Planning's rezoning. So this was an unusual process. And I would say it took a lot of strength and energy to get the Department of City Planning to sit back and allow the East Harlem neighborhood to do that planning. A lot of that was helped by the fact that the city council speaker at the time was the local council person, Melissa Mark Viverito. So that did lend a little bit of extra power to this plan. But when you all just did a poll asking, who's the best person or the best group of people to shape a community-based plan, and I think the majority of you answered it should be community members, that was definitely our take. And the real basis of this work was drawing on community members. And I don't have the diagram in here, but there's essentially concentric circles that started with a steering group, radiated out to a series of subgroups that I'll talk to in a minute that looked at certain topics, and then finally out to the wider public who really were meant to own this plan. And so this process started with a steering committee that was composed mostly of not-for-profits in the area, but there was one developer, local developer on that group as well. And they really formed a core part of this process. Their job was really to listen and then ultimately to approve the recommendations that went into the neighborhood plan. And so when we conceived of this neighborhood plan, and I heard it come up in that video that you showed, Felix, which was great. The idea was, again, not to just talk about the single use of zoning, but really make sure zoning was integrated into a series of categories. Ultimately, we wound up with 11 themes underneath these larger categories. And each of these themes, and so just to go through them quickly, we were thinking about things like open space and recreation and safety and zoning, but also economic development and business, schools and health, affordable housing, looking specifically at NYCHA as well. And what we wound up doing was a very intense process. It went on for 8 months. And essentially, each of those steering committee leads was responsible for one of those themes. And each of those themes went through a process. So we did have hundreds and hundreds of meetings. It really required a huge input from people. But essentially, there was a lot of work that was done at a subgroup level to identify issues, to take those issues to the community, large-scale community visioning workshops. That subgroup would summarize the findings, take the findings to a steering committee, get their reaction, and then they would develop recommendations. Now, at that point, they would look at those recommendations and share them with agencies, not just city planning, but parks, EDC, Department of Transportation. And the point there was not to be swayed by them, but to get some feedback. What are some of the agency priorities that are already in place? And then those conversations were turned into the final draft recommendations, and ultimately the steering committee voted on those. And then finally, there was another community visioning workshop. And all of those themes went through this process. So you can imagine it was a tremendous, tremendous effort. We set up a real protocol for how voting would occur, how to understand the kind of feasibility and reasonability of each of these recommendations, thinking about recommendations that were policy-based or programmatic or were capital projects. And ultimately, we had a report that came out the other end. And so here's a few images of this process, really involving people out on the streets, as going into restaurants and shops to talk to people in addition to these community-wide workshops. The workshops themselves had about 1,000 participants. And of course, the key issues in East Harlem are different than what you'll have in Eastern Queens. And I'm a real believer in local planning. And I understand that, you know, the city has to set policy and they have their needs, but it's not always aligned with local concerns. In the context of East Harlem, there was a basic issue, which was that the zoning in East Harlem had a very, what we call a large envelope, which meant that developers could come in and do a lot of as-of-right zoning without changing the zoning. There was a lot of infill, new development coming in. And they were essentially taking over buildings where the affordable housing subsidies were timing out, were running out. And so they were losing, we did a lot of data work to show that they were losing almost 300 units of affordable housing every year. And so at that time in the city, when you rezoned, there was mandatory inclusionary housing as a new policy that would allow for some new affordable housing to be built. And so that really allowed the community to come to a place and say, in some cases and in some places, we are comfortable with some new development. We want it for economic development reasons. We want it to increase the affordable housing supply that we're losing, and also for some of the funding that it could bring to this area. And so we came up with a document that was quite extensive. It had over 200 recommendations, and it was actually 11 categories in the end. We didn't put a dollar amount on it. And the city went away. I will tell you, they didn't immediately follow everything in the plan. There was a lot of negotiation and back and forth, but they began to look at our broader categories. They didn't just look at zoning and affordable housing and land use. They began to look at open space and the streets. And there was something called a points of agreement that resulted in almost $300 million being committed to projects that had been recommended in the neighborhood plan. And so this gets very into the weeds, but you know, we essentially compared what came out of the East Harlem neighborhood plan, which suggested rezonings, including some preservation where they didn't want any growth or development. So essentially preservation zoning, and then showing in 2017 where the council landed. And so there was a lot of back and forth, but a lot of cohesion to what the community had envisioned. You know, this is work that we continued to do afterwards, which was looking at the future development of a public market. Actually, there was a historic market in East Harlem to rebuild that. So $30 million has been committed to that, and EDC still plans to finish that development. Our work included a recommendation from the community to protect tenants from landlord harassment, and that was passed as part of the rezoning. And there were a number of things that were successful policies that we had suggested in the plan that were brought to fruition. So I hope that's helpful. And again, it's not like a 197A plan. It really came in response to the fact that the city was going to rezone this area, and the neighborhood and the city council and the community board said, hold on, we want to do our plan first. And ultimately it had a lot of good results. The city doesn't always love to do this, I will tell you that, because they like to come in and do their own thing. But in this case, we were able to get them to wait and to listen, and ultimately to adhere to a lot of what was in that plan.
That is awesome, Mr. Lubinsky. Thank you so much. Any other questions or comments from Mr. Lubinsky regarding this plan? Well, matter of fact, before that, let's have Ms. McGrath present, and then we'll have questions afterward for both of them. Mr. McGrath?
Yeah, sure, Felix. I just wanted to do a time check. How long do you think?
Yes, 10, 15 minutes.
10, 15 minutes. Okay. I just wanted to make sure, because Adam had to leave, maybe there's questions before he leaves?
It's okay. I don't mind sticking around a bit.
Okay, thank you, Adam.
Yeah.
Yeah, like Adam, I'm very impressed with this meeting. Thank you, Felix and Barbara. And I'm very happy to reciprocate for Barbara because she came to my class last semester at Parsons School of Design. I'm a professor of urban design at Parsons and also part of the Tishman Center for Environmental Design at the New School. Parsons is a division of the New School. And I'm not speaking as a planner. I'm an architect and urban designer. You know, you might think of architects as the people that the developer hires to build those buildings, to get them through the ULURP. But there is a big role of architecture as a public good. And so I want to speak to that and how you might leverage the resources in New York City to get that kind of expertise around the issues that are important to you. And then urban design as public service as well. And so I just offer these as tools for community planning. And if I can go. So public architecture, I'm going to introduce you to some of the nonprofits who work and support architecture for the public good in this city and give you one example quickly. Urban Design Services, I'm going to speak mostly about my experience in Newark, New Jersey, you know, with neighborhood planning, much like Adam talks about, but it was really a 20-year effort that began in the absence of planning before Cory Booker became mayor, and then it really reached a lot of success under the mayorship of Cory Booker. And we did that through a lot of public agencies, but also some grants that I'll talk about. And then I'm offering an invitation to work with you guys, with my students in the upcoming academic year, and the proposal for an academic partnership with Parsons School of Design and the New School Tishman Center.
Oh.
So the organizations that you know, have done this kind of work, and more so, spread across the 5 boroughs and across the region. There's the Municipal Art Society, the Architecture League of New York, the Van Allen Institute, the New York Center for Architecture. I'm going to talk about the Baltimore Ecosystem Study, that's not in New York, the Urban Design Forum, Design Trust for Public Space, and the Institute for Public Architecture. Vacant Lots is a project that I was a coordinator with back in the 1980s. It was the first kind of public service architecture project that I did with the Architectural League. And Alexis mentioned HPD, Housing Preservation and Development. And so this is working with housing preservation and development in the 5 boroughs, vacant lots across the whole city, and getting architects from to volunteer their work and provide ideas for specific neighborhoods for the redevelopment of vacant lots based on the actual needs of the housing community. For instance, this project on the lower right is townhouses, but that also has what are called granny flats. So you could have extended family housing. And then in terms of public funded, this is the Baltimore Ecosystem Study that I mentioned. And this is funded by the National Science Foundation, the U.S. Department of Agricultural Forest Service, U.S. Geological Survey, but also city planning in Baltimore, but then the county, and then the local organizations are Parks and People Foundation and dozens of neighborhood and community organizations. And so this is a huge project, and you can see the outline of Baltimore City is the square here on the Chesapeake Bay. And but the research site extends to the suburbs out in Baltimore County, and it's based on watersheds. And because the whole research is to clean up the Chesapeake Bay. And so, and as an architect, I'm very interested because there's 1 million landowners in this watershed, over 1 million. And if I worked as a, you know, by commission, it would take 1 million architects or me 1 million years to design the solution. So it's more working in a multidisciplinary way to sort of get at the root of the problems. And so What we do is we drill down to neighborhoods. I just show one, for example, within this watershed. This is Baseman Ron, a kind of ranch house, older inner ring suburb that the solutions we really look at are what a person can do on their own property, what the city can do in terms of the right of way, and then what you can do in the areas like you've been talking about, the underutilized land and the in-between zone that you share with your neighbors. The second part, urban design services. So for 20 years, I was a resident of Newark, New Jersey, and worked with the Ironbound Community Corporation as a member of the community, not as a hired professional. And we started planning, neighborhood planning, and got a small grant from Wachovia Bank, now Wells Fargo. We got a neighborhood planning grant. And that led to certain housing guidelines, which was funded by the Regional Plan Association. They did something like the vacant lots, where they hosted a great number of architects looking at the housing that was specific to this Ironbound neighborhood and promoting solutions to it. And then the waterfront park, the land was actually added by a donation by the Trust for Public Land, but also the city of Newark, and the Essex County is actually the owners and builders and managers of that park. And just briefly, because it relates so much to your own neighborhood, the Ironbound is this M neighborhood that used to exist on the bend of the Passaic River next to the wetlands at Newark Bay. And then, so it's the poorer neighborhood, the working class neighborhood, while the better class housing is more to the west in this map, where the parks are and all the better housing stock is. And so this is that neighborhood today, and it isn't surrounded by a wetland, it's surrounded by industrial zone and Newark Liberty International Airport and the container port of New York and New Jersey. So the environmental impacts of this neighborhood are not just the legacy of industrial pollution. This is a metal baling plant that was next to a recreation site. You can see the stands, the kids were playing football there, and all that contaminants was leaching there when I took this photograph 20 years ago. And then the new kind of environmental, and Patrick, you mentioned this, the logistics and the containers and the trucks and everything coming into the community. This is what used to serve the industry. That's what's left of one of the freight railroad that used to run through there. And then what you can see is like this old brewery switched from rail transit, where the rail was bringing wheat from the Midwest to make the beer. And now it's all trucking. And so you can see how impossible it is to cross that road. And then the housing stock is single, two, and even triplex housing that's been there for 100 years, built by German immigrants, then occupied by Italian, Irish, Portuguese, Brazilian, and now Ecuadorian, Central American. But this was the new housing that was being built by developers. They would tear down an old factory and build what are basically called Bayonne boxes. There's no more street anymore because it's all a series of driveways and two flats and two car garages, and built on sealed, contaminated land. So this is the neighborhood plan that we ended up with in the end, with many of the recommendations and the complexity that Adam was talking about. And you can see the kind of traffic situation of the trucks and the kind of traffic calming. That was a really important part of it. And this is the housing, some of the housing recommendations that was part of the RPA plan that came out of it. And this is our new waterfront park. Please, come to Newark and see this amazing park. And so finally, I would offer an academic partnership to you all in Eastern Queens. It's the School of Constructed Environments, where we teach architects at Parsons School of Design in the new school. We're a making school. This is our making center. And believe it or not, there's a factory on Fifth Avenue, the second story of this building on Fifth Avenue. And you can see our students using that making shop to make a street seats project even before COVID, when Department of Transportation has the Street Seats program. And so annually, our students make a public space and redesign it and resubmit it to the community board for approval annually. Speaking of Union Settlement, Adam, we built Union Settlement's garden pavilion in East Harlem. At our design workshop, our graduate students built that or designed it in the spring with the community input and built it in the summer. And then finally, that's kind of in the academic program of the school, but I'm also associate director and lead this infrastructure design and justice lab at the Tishman Center Environmental Design at the New School. And then this lab is where we sort of create a forum where we have students make models and things like that, where you can bring all your issues to a table and it can be discussed. And you engage, the kind of pedagogy of environmental justice that we promote at the Tishman Center. And we have an archive. We've been doing it for 4 years, where you can look at other ideas and projects that have accumulated over time. And so the way this research has been structured is around infrastructure. And so we started in Newark, where we have the seaport, but the airport, but also the old rail lines. And we followed the old rail line, freight rail line that goes through from Sunset Park up to Astoria and into the South Bronx, Newtown Creek, and Sunset Park waterfronts, Staten Island waterfront. But last year, and the reason I invited Barbara to come and speak to us is we looked at the impact of JFK on the neighborhoods of Southeast Queens. And I have more to talk about that. I can give you a lecture at some other time, but basically this last image is what did this New York region, both Newark, Ironbound over here, and Southeast Queens look like 100 years ago before the airports and the highways were built. And this is kind of the fill that you're confronted with now. So it's not only the impact of the airport, it's this tremendous landfill that blocks all that water flow, all that ecosystem that I mentioned earlier in Baltimore. So that's like a rapid introduction, but I hope to have a long-term partnership and get to know you all much better.
Oh, wow, that's great, Mr. McGrath. Thank you so much for that. Any questions for Mr. McGrath or Mr. Lubinsky? Please put it in the chat.
Yeah, see 2 hands.
Ms. Coulter, let's go Ms. Coulter first.
Coulter first and then Patrick Evans.
Hi, I did have a question referring back to the rezoning of the area. Now, I know New York State was redistricted. Does the redistricting of New York State affect the zoning of the areas?
No.
No, I mean, I can respond. I mean, no, the zoning is, a separate policy that's set by the New York City Department of City Planning. So it's not affected by that redistricting process.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Yes.
Actually, you got a question?
Yes, I have a question for Mr. Adam Lubinsky. You spoke about financing that was needed to bring together the East Harlem project. My question to you is, can that financing be available to community groups that are not incorporated and not 501c3?
It's a good question. I mean, in our case, there were a few groups that were funded, and the funding went directly from either foundational support to not-for-profits that were technical assistance. So like Hester Street Collaborative, Community Voices Heard, the Urban Justice Center, they were funded through foundation money, and they were all 501c3s. And then we were funded actually through the Economic Development Corporation. And so in this case, the money was actually going to the technical assistance folks and not directly to, the community board. Now, the community board now, there is eligible funding that I know City Council has set aside for community boards. We worked on a project in East Flatbush with the Land Use Committee that was, they're not huge sums of money, but I think there's somewhere between $40,000 and $80,000 grants that are given and are available every year for planning purposes. So, but I can't quite answer your question about how those funds might land with groups that aren't incorporated as 501c3s.
I mean, the dynamic to that question was we just saw a film. We talked about a film where the community was just coming together at large to be proactive and get involved. So I just was wondering, like, if that was to happen, would there be some available funding opportunities, for a group that's just starting up and, getting proactive, and they see some things that they want to deal with in their community? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take one more question, then we'll move on. Crystal Brown, do you have a question?
Good evening, everyone. And Felix, I congratulate you and Barbara on this great forum. And I have to tell you, Adam and Brian, that I am so impressed with all the projects that you've accomplished. And it encourages me because when I look around the city, I drive around and I see a lack of planning when it comes to the developers. And I drive around Long Island City, through on Queens Boulevard, through Rego Park and Forest Hills, and I just see these tall towers being thrown up without consideration for amenities or to care about the people who are going to live in those neighborhoods. And it's really just discouraging to see this encroachment coming to Southeast Queens and the towers that they want to build here. And so your work encourages me, and I know what, was just talked about in terms of a partnership. I just feel the city is kind of caving into these developers and for profit motive, just building these enormous, ugly towers. So I commend you on your work. It's wonderful work. And I do hope that there could be some kind of partnership in the future for Southeast Queens. Thank you.
Thank you, Crystal. I'm sorry, we take one more question because Alexis does have a question in the chat. Alexis, what was your question?
We have to hold the city council to the fire because they're the ones that are agreeing to this. And the mayor is just signing off on it. He's not the one that's actually making the plans. And Brian and Adam can attest to this. You have to call the city council in your area and even in different districts and say, listen, we don't want this. And this is why it's very important that we are constantly on the HPD website and we're constantly looking out for these RFPs because we can be the ones that are applying for them. Actually, my partner Vishna is actually on here. I'm so happy she came from Take Root Justice. Hopefully she can have a 2 minutes to introduce herself if she's here, Vishna. But we have to make sure that we are the ones that are applying for these RFPs so the developers are listening to us because they can have, we can have as many forms as we want, but if the developers are not going to listen to us and do what we want, then that's going to be the problem. And then if the city council is going to sign off on it, then that's another problem if we the ones that vote them in office. So for me, Power, Sylvania, Councilwoman Power Brooks is my councilwoman. So I've been communicating with her about HPD and the Community Land Trust and really making sure that we hold these city council members accountable. And not only, but Mayor Adams has taken a lot of money from developers. And the way developers did it was they didn't do it themselves. They had their employees contribute. So like how our Lieutenant Deputy Governor is about to go to jail for taking money from developers. We need to make sure that we're looking at Eric Adams and what money he so he might be the next one to join him. I don't want him to, but we gotta look at who we're putting in office and who they're taking money from.
Oh, come on now.
Thank you, Alexis. Thank you so much. We'll come back to Vishna, but I want to get into this last section of the program. We have one more quick poll, and then we'll have 2 quick videos. setting up this poll now. Barbara?
Yes, and the last quick poll is, and they're mostly yes, no, and not sure. So in an effort to create more affordable housing, should the government provide funding for illegal basement conversions? Yes, no, not sure. Are accessory dwelling units a good means of providing affordable housing? Yes, no, not sure. Will TODs, transit oriented districts, make life more convenient for urban living? Yes, no, not sure. Do you support the development of TODs around the railroad or substations, subway stations in your neighborhood?
What's TOD? What's TOD again?
Transit oriented districts.
Oh, like JFK.
Well, yeah, I mean, we'll go more into that. So maybe you're not
Okay.
sure at this point.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. And what is the best way to provide affordable housing to those in need? And you have a bunch of different possible choices. Section 8, build more housing projects, accessory dwelling units, transit-oriented development, affordable units within larger residential development projects. Not sure, all of the above. So there's no right or wrong answer to any of these. We just trying to get a sense of what you think. So if people have responded to all of these, I'm going to end the poll, see what kind of results we have. So most of you, 62% said in an effort to create more affordable housing, we should not provide funding for illegal basement conversions. 69% said to number 2, are accessory dwelling units a good measure for affordable housing? Most of you said no. We're divided here, transit-oriented development, and that's probably because not everybody knows what that is, but it's pretty divided, and 46% said not sure. Do you support the development of TODs around the railroad? And again, 38, that's divided. 38% said no, and 38% are not sure. And what is the best way to provide affordable housing? And well, 31% are saying build more housing projects. And then we have a healthy 23%, I guess, for affordable units within larger residential development projects, and another, and 23% said not sure. So it gives a spread, and that means we have a lot of further conversations to do. Back to you, Felix.
All right, thank you, Barbara. All right, so the last section is going to require, we'll show 2 videos, one on ADUs and one on TODs, which will explain it. First, we're going to run the ADU video.
How is everybody doing today? I'm Cameron Meredith with ADU West Coast, and today we're going to talk about what ADU stands for. What is an ADU? And then we're going to go through and talk about, or just kind of show you some examples, some floor plans. That way you get an idea of what this is and what people are doing as far as accessory dwelling units. But with that being said, an ADU actually stands for accessory dwelling unit. You might have already heard that as a mother-in-law quarter or granny flat. There's other little names for it, but pretty much what people are doing, especially here in California, is they're building accessory dwelling units in their backyard or out of their garage as another unit on their property. I won't go into too much details of the rules of that. I think this video is just going to be what an accessory dwelling unit is. That way you can kind of get a feel and an idea for it. So first off, let's talk about, just exactly what that is. So it's a separate structure. It can be either out of a detached garage, It actually technically doesn't have to be separate. It can be out of a detached garage and attached garage. You can actually create a junior ADU out of a part of your living room or a part of your existing house into another livable space. But pretty much an accessory dwelling unit stands for another separate living space that has its own kitchen, bath, and it's its own separate living facility. So in order for it to be permitted as an accessory dwelling unit, it has to have a functioning kitchen and bath, okay? So those are some requirements. Here is just an example of a one-bedroom ADU unit. So you can kind of see how that lays out. So again, it could be, let's say this is a 2-car garage. You can convert that into a 1-bedroom or a studio. And then you can also build, if your backyard's big enough, from the ground up here. So this would be your 1-bedroom accessory dwelling unit here. And then here is your 2-bedroom accessory dwelling unit. So if you have a little bit bigger garage, or if you wanted to extend that garage out, that's doable. And then also if you wanted to obviously build it from the ground up, if your lot's big enough, one rule is it has to be 50% of the existing square footage of the main house. So for example, if your main house was 2,000 square feet, you can build a 1,000 square foot accessory dwelling unit in your backyard. So again, these are just layouts. There's a 1-bedroom and a 2-bedroom for you to look at. I did want to go through a property here. That way you get an idea of the look from the top, the Google Maps view. This is not a project that we've done. It's just one to show you guys an example. I do have pictures of it. I found it on the MLS online. But here, this property, you can see what they did. It's a single family lot. Here's that single family home. And then right over here in this garage area, that's where they built the ADU out of. So you can see it's 2 separate structures. That's usually a pretty good setup for an accessory dwelling unit, just because it's 2 separate living facilities. And then, you know, as we go through the pictures here, you can see how they did that. So there's the front of the house. It's loading up here. There we go. So there's the front of the house. And then as we go in the back, we already entered inside the accessory dwelling unit. So this is what it looks like from the inside. That way you guys can kind of see what it looks like. They did a little bit nicer finishes in this. It looks like they got some nice wood floors. They got a beam in there. So this one looks like it's done pretty well, and it looks pretty spacious. Obviously they have a studio. You can see the bedroom here. It's one big open space. But something like this, you know, you can either move your an in-law in, you can move a younger, you know, adult in, family member. You can also rent it out. So for this area, I mean, something like this, you can probably get $1,700, $1,800 for something like that. So again, here's kind of their outdoor space. Most of them have little outdoor spots, but that's pretty much it. Again, it's just wanted to keep the video short, just kind of go over what an accessory dwelling unit is. Again, it's a 2nd or 3rd living facility, and it has to have a functioning bath as well as a functioning kitchen. So it has to be a totally separate living facility. But if anybody here has any questions on that, feel free to comment below. You can also follow us on our website, on our Instagram, Facebook, and all that. And again, we'd love to answer any questions, and we'll post some more videos here soon. Thanks.
Okay, and finally, the last video tonight is TODs, transit-oriented development.
You've probably heard the term transit-oriented development frequently in news stories and other media about urban planning and development. Transit-oriented development, frequently referred to by its acronym TOD, is in the news a lot because it describes one of the most highly sought-after outcomes of contemporary planning. As the phrase implies, transit-oriented development deliberately locates new buildings at or near public transit modes, like light rail lines, subway lines, and frequent high-capacity bus routes. The benefits of locating desirable land usage and emissions and reduced congestion. But like so many other words critical to an understanding of how communities are changing, the term requires a little explanation. That's because, like so many other phrases in urban planning, there is no universal definition for transit-oriented development. Different government agencies use different metrics to determine what kind of TOD works best for their planning and development goals. and cities set zoning and building codes accordingly. The fact that TOD results in such a huge variety of land uses and building types contributes to some of the confusion about the definition. TOD can include almost every form of land use, from residential to office to retail to industrial. All forms of high-demand land uses stand to benefit from being located near transit stations. Given this desirability, many cities in recent years and decades have found new ways to encourage TOD, like more permissive zoning codes and other development incentives. The desirability of transit-oriented development also means that the term can be deployed cynically. Astute observers should be careful to note when the term is being used as a marketing slogan and when it's being used as a policy proposal. And now you're well on your way to being one of the people who can tell the difference.
Okay, so those are ADUs and TODs. So I have a question before we go on. I know we're running a little long with 12 minutes over time, but if you want it, we can take this discussion on maybe to another time. But I just want to give an update on what's going on regarding ADUs and TODs. So if everyone can hang out for another 10, 15 minutes, would that be okay?
Yes. Well, we guess so. Okay.
Real quick then. Thank you, Cheryl. All right, so back in January of this year, Governor Hochul proposed a one-line, not even one line, a one-word statement regarding ADUs and TODs. And basically, later on, she had state senators and assembly people write concurrent bills to her budget regarding implementing ADUs and TODs throughout the state, regardless of whether the area is single family or two family zone. Well, of course, without any lead, a lot of people in New York raised an uproar about that, especially in Long Island and upstate Westchester. Because of all the uproar, she pulled that from her budget. And that budget was worth $25 billion over 5 years in order to basically create this affordable housing by creating ADUs and then basically essentially destroying single family homes. Since Queens is mostly a single family home area, that would have devastated us. So for that, that is currently out of the bill. So the discussion here is basically a question and answer to you all on what do you think about ADUs and TODs, and can you think of an example of a TOD that's going on in that area? I'll put that out to the audience.
Okay, so hands up if you have responses. What do you think about ADUs, TODs? And can you think of an example? And I would say it's a conversation just not localized to New York, but it's really those two concepts are, those are global concepts. So
we go to Gloria.
Yeah, we have three hands up.
We go to Gloria, and then we'll go to Alexis and then Sandra.
Okay, thank you. Well, I don't know that I necessarily think that ADUs and TODs are bad ideas in and of themselves, but I think that what happens, especially from what I can see in our own communities, what happens is that they are used as reactive responses to a situation. We need to have more housing, so we look to see where we can, quote unquote, dump it. And that, you know, and we do that without consideration for the way that that's going to impact the character of the community, the quality of life of the people who live there. We do that without, I don't get the sense that we even think about things like the electric grid, the power grid, and how that's impacting that, how that's impacting the sewer systems, how that's impacting the educational, the schools in our communities, the open spaces. I think that we just kind of dump stuff in order to solve a problem as a city. And what was so exciting about what Mr. McGrath and his partner were talking about was taking a more holistic look at a community, looking at a problem that you may have, looking at a holistically looking at a community and seeing how you can develop a solution that makes sense for all. So that's where I think, that's where my head is, and that's what I don't see happening, and that's what's so discouraging and quite frankly scary.
Thank you, Gloria. Alexa, you got a question?
I think because a lot of the residents, a lot of the homeowners actually in Far Rockaway disagree with it too. I think what it is that people have been doing irresponsible housing for so long with people who are mentally challenged, who are AKA suffering from mental illness, that I think that it put it casted a bad spell on ADUs because we are in need of housing. So I think that's what the situation is. People have been doing irresponsible housing with our veterans, with the SROs, that people don't want to see these type of housings happen. And it could happen in a responsible way, like the video that we saw, right? They do have those. They have the ADUs and everything where the garages used to be, if you watch the video. So it has to be done responsibly, right? Because you have all these you have people coming out of mental illness who are going into housing and don't have supportive services. And that's the problem. You are not providing supportive services to those who are coming into their own homes. And that's what's making it bad.
Right.
Thank you, Alexis. Sandra?
I definitely agree with the other two speakers that spoke just before me. I live in Southeast Queens and we're pretty much zoned for one-family homes. And by putting in ADUs, and that's my primary concern, you definitely have to take into consideration the water, the sewer lines, the electrical grids, and all the other things that have to support these ADUs. I just don't see putting them in backyards as a solution to affordable housing. There are many, there are vacant buildings, vacant lots, old manufacturing areas that can be redesigned to provide more suitable housing with the appropriate infrastructure to go along with it. And also the speaker that mentioned services that many people looking for affordable housing need. I don't see ADUs satisfying that issue as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Patrick, and then I'll go to one more person. You still have a question, Patrick?
Hi, yes. I tend to disagree with all. And the reason why is because according to census data, New York City already have 1 million plus people in the boroughs since David Dinkins' administration, 1 million plus people. Those people are here already. So when we talk about increased pressures on schools, increased pressures on infrastructure, increased pressure on garbage and so forth, they're here already. They're here. So the increased pressure is what I see when I go out my door and I see my neighbor has a lot of garbage and I only have one bag every 2 weeks because their house is lived out to capacity. So that is here already. Those kids are going to school already. They're already running the water. They're cleaning all the cars that we don't have parking for in our blocks no more. That is done. What is needed is affordable housing. The question becomes, where can these people live outside of illegal basements, SROs that are in my neighborhood too? Where can they live? So conversely, the governor is looking at a shrinkage in New York State population. People are leaving the state because they can't find a place to live and it's unaffordable. So they go to neighboring states. So the city has gained population, the state has lost population. they have to correct that because that affects the tax base, that affects a whole lot of things. It affects services, whether they're going to be able to pick up all that garbage that my neighbors are already creating. So I understand I'm unpopular on this, but I do believe that that is the landscape, and we have to look at what we're going to be. Mr. McGrath and Adam Lubinsky, they have a better insight as to where this metropolis is going, because everybody thinks that we're going to be the way we are today. When we get to 2 million more people, it's gonna change. So ultimately, where are we going? And we're gonna have to accommodate these people with housing. This place wasn't the place that my mother grew up and my father grew up in. It's more dense, way more dense than when they were kids. And now we are looking at it becoming even more denser. I'm finished. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Mr. Swire, do you have a question or comment before we go?
Okay, and Mamos Nelson, when is
here's
yes.
here's what I have to say. I agree with the first two speakers, because progress, you do have progress, and you're gonna have people, but we don't want to make the same mistakes you make when you were doing Manhattan and Brooklyn, and you run out of you don't have the facility to accommodate the people. You don't have the infrastructure, and you got to think about it. And are these people all going to be? Somebody said something about are they going to be mixed people in these new income buildings? Are they going to be all poor people? Are they going to the economic is going to be mixed in these places?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right, in a lot of instances, yeah, they're talking about different income levels. So a certain number of affordable units, and the rest would be market rate.
Barbara, before we go, there's Ms. Buhika want to say something real quick. Vishna.
Hi, good evening all. Thank you so much for this amazing event and for opening it up. Alexis invited me to join, and I've learned so much this evening. I'm an attorney with Take Root Justice. We're a neighborhood, we're a community-based nonprofit. We do movement lawyering, so we work with community organizers. And my practice area is called Equitable Neighborhoods. And what we do is we work on land justice issues. So we know Mrs. Alexis Foote because we work with her in her neighborhood in Edgemere on a CLT project applying for this these public city lots for the community to have a say in how they're going to be developed. So it's very interesting to hear about all of y'all's work and all these interesting projects and ideas. And I think it's going to be really interesting kind of keeping up with you all and seeing if there's maybe ways for Alexis to continue learning from you and bringing back this knowledge to our project. It's been really wonderful. But our organization is called Take Root Justice. If you're ever in need of talking to free lawyers that are paid for by the city or foundations about land use issues, rezonings, we do that stuff. So I'm not here to like plug it. We don't charge for the work that we do, but if if you're working on a community project and would like to talk to us, I think I can drop our website in the chat.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much. So I just want to say thank you for everyone for attending. Part of our goal was to inform the community on what's going on and different ways that we can impact what we want to see in our community based on community engagement. As Mr. Lubinsky and Mr. Graff outlined, it's not going to be an easy process, but it can be done if we're willing to do the work. I just want to say thank you for hanging in there. We ran over a little late, but I thought it was very informative, and I hope you guys were inspired to continue to participate. I'm going to just turn over now to Barbara to close us out.
Yeah.
Barbara?
Okay, yes, and I want to thank people for hanging in there also. As Felix said, we did run over a little bit, or a lot. I really want to thank our speakers and Michael Malia, who is the, or Malia, who is the Community Board Land Use Chair, but also as an architect in his own right. I certainly also want to thank Dr. Brian McGrath and Adam Lubinsky, and to thank you for sharing your expertise with us. And we definitely look forward to a partnership. Brian, you talked about an academic partnership, so we certainly want to talk to you further about that. And I want to thank all the committee members, because the EQA Sustainable Housing Working Group, we've been working very hard. I've been just a member of the group. Thanks to Felix Thompson, who as chairperson of the group, for kind of guiding us and moving us along, to Darlene Peoples, Paula Johnson, Patrick Evans, Price Olivier, Latanya Collins, Jihan Joseph, and Michael Scotland for all of their work in helping to make what we've done so far, help it to be successful. And we're going to have continued conversations, and maybe even looking at some land use projects in Southeast Queens. I would say that if any of you are interested in working on the Sustainable Housing Working Group, just reach out to us, because it's not just EQA members who sit at the Eastern Queens Alliance table. Some of the members of the working group actually are community people who want to make a difference, and so they wanted to work with us. So if you're interested in this topic, then definitely reach out, and we'll pull you in. And there's always lots of work for you to do. So thank you again to everybody, and stay tuned for our next forum. If you have a suggestion as to what additional topics that we should take up in the housing, please put it in the chat, and we will look at it, because our next meeting, we will be not only looking at what worked here, but where we should be going in the future. So thank you. Alexis, did you have a last word there?
Oh, I'm gonna send you a flyer. Can I send it to the Eastern Queens Alliance, and I can share a flyer where they're having a forum tomorrow at Rise, which about land and everything. So I'll send it to you, okay, Ms. Brown?
Okay, yes, great.
Yes, God bless you guys, and thank you so much. This was amazing.
You're welcome. And our Eastern Queens Alliance, the Idlewild Environmental Center is finally open, and we are going to have a ribbon cutting open house on April 28th. So stay tuned for that. There also is a forum. No, there's a waste not expo on April 30th. You should have been getting flyers for that, but stay tuned for that. And we're running some, next week is Earth Week. We're going to have some children's workshops. So if anybody has children or grandchildren or what have you, and you're interested, look for the flyers. We've been getting all of that out to the public. So thank you and good night.
Good night, everyone.
Night. Good night. Thank you.
Good night.